Good morning. This is Talking Torah and Tzedek, an Uri L'Tzedek project. I'm Judry Subar. I'm here with Rabbi Isaiah Rothstein. Rabbi Isaiah, good morning. How are you?
Hi, shalom, shalom.
So, Rabbi Rothstein is currently the, let's see if I have this right, the Rabbinic scholar and public affairs advisor at the Jewish Federations of North America, position that he recently took on after having worked with and for a number of other organizations in the social justice realm and otherwise. Rabbi Isaiah, why don't you tell us a little bit about the position that you have right now at Federation and some of the other things that you've done with your life before that, or at the same time?
Great. So the Jewish Federations of North America is the central office for 146 independent federations throughout the country. We also have 300 network communities that we support as well. And the Jewish Federations of North America are all of us combined are in the top 10 philanthropy charities, philanthropic charities in the world. So in many ways, the work that the Jewish Federations are currently doing and that the federations have been involved with for nearly 100 years has supported Jewish life, those who are most vulnerable, and really to be able to lift up a world around us and to bring love, unity, companionship, and support and relief wherever it might be needed. And how I got to the Jewish Federations of North America, it was kind of a series, I think, of events, and hopefully all moments in our lives. So for me, I first was introduced to the Federation system through UJ in New York. In 2010, I was an intern, in a fellowship through the Wiener Educational Fellowship as a social work fellow, while I was getting my smicha, my rabbinic ordination at Yeshiva University, and my master's in social work. But really JFNA was when I was working for Chazon started sharing office space, renting office space from JFNA, from Jewish Federations of North America. And then it was during that time that I started meeting staff. It was during that time that by the coffee station, and I got to know people. I was invited to speak at a Rosh Hashanah program for the staff. I brought my guitar, spoke, to the diversity of their staff as well, people from all different backgrounds, and bringing the energy of the high holidays as we're engaging in now to the community. And frankly, what excited me about that, even just that one session, was that it was diverse. It was people of Jewish and non-Jewish backgrounds, people of different colors, and I thrive. I get excited by those environments, partially due to my background of being mixed race and growing up in a mixed race family, but also just because I think the diversity of the Jewish people and who we are, and seeing that we are people that come from different places and different backgrounds. And so to honor different places and different backgrounds is a part of our spiritual makeup and our spiritual DNA. I participated in a few other events for Jewish Federations of North America while working for Chazon. And it was really in the last few months and after the murder of George Floyd, where I received a call, and Nigel Savage, the CEO of Chazon, he called me and he said, "I just got off the phone with Eric Fingerhut, the CEO of JFNA. And I spoke to Eric, and we had a series of conversations, and really recognizing the need in this moment to continue to steward a process for envisioning a Jewish community that has racial equity and racial justice as a centerpiece." So through my conversations with Eric, it one thing led to the next. And I was hired at Jewish Federations of North America to focus on really two primary areas. One is to focus internally at JFNA, our office, as well as the Federation system, in supporting educational initiatives and consulting and offering support as it relates to racial equity and racial justice. We have our curriculum that we're launching currently, our training curriculum called the Jedi Training Curriculum, which stands for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And so that's how do we bring a Jedi lens to our work as a federated system? How do we support our partners and agencies? How do we work multi-generational and through our strengths that we have in the system? My second bucket of work is very much involved in race relations and public policy and legislation, and thinking about how do we bring the Jedi lens to our public policy work that we do as well. And so that's a little bit about how I got to this current role that I'm sitting in at Jewish Federations of North America. And I'll also say that systems changing in general, when we think about social justice, activism, and we think about how do we actually bring a narrative and a story that supports the Jewish values that we have in this generation to lift up the world and to support those in need. I think that the work that I've seen so far, and the work that I think the Jewish Federations have been doing for 100 years, are to be able to do that again for the next 100 years of Jewish life.
Maybe you could talk just for a second about some of the specific initiatives, or some of the specific projects that you're working on, with an eye towards speaking to people who are not necessarily in the Federation world, but who care about some of the issues that you've been talking about, and how they can either get involved or grow with regard to their connection with the importance of these issues and so forth.
Yes, thank you. I think, when it comes to work that I'm doing around racial equity and racial justice, the hope is that when we peel away the layers, we remind ourselves that we come from a common humanity, a common bond, right? And so that idea of that each of us have our own identities, we have our own context of how we come into the world, we have our own stories, we have our own perspective and lens, is something that should be familiar to us. How our identities and how we navigate the world, that sometimes is something that we don't necessarily create space enough for to unpack, right? In Jewish communal life, in synagogues, and joining and being in community, the hope is that we are finding ourselves and seeing ourselves within the community. When I walk into a synagogue, when I walk into a school setting, when I walk into a Jewish organization, how am I seeing myself in the community? Right, so this idea of representation, right? We want to see ourselves in where we show up. When we hang out with friends, when we decide to sign up for a program, something that we have embodied in who we are. So the hope for me, and what I think a lot of the work that we're building out at Jewish Federations of North America, but also I would say that we're seeing so much in Jewish life in the 21st century, right, is about how do we honor the multiple voices that we hold as 21st century Jews, and how do we hold the different intersections of who we are. And so I think, like, for looking at the future of American Jewry, we have these core questions that we should be asking around representation. Do I feel like my identity is enough, right? And if there's a dominant voice, how do we actually create spaces that honor the multiple identities that people hold, right? There's also a question of tradition and how we bring the voice of Jewish values and Jewish life into our communities. So I think definitely the work of JFNA, but I would also say Jewish communal life in the 21st century is really calling upon us to think more critically around identity as a whole, and making sure that we're creating spaces that hold the varying identities of Jewish American life.
I'd like to ask you just a bit about your personal identity. You said a few minutes ago that you're from a mixed race background. I've heard you refer to yourself as a Jew of color. How does that identity relate to your work? And do you think that this is probably an impossible question to answer, but I'll ask it anyhow. If you were of a different racial identity, how do you think you would do your work? Right.
Like, I mean, I'll also say the part of the question for me is also like, how does our personal identity inform the work that we do and how we see the world? So,
yeah.
And also, yes.
Yeah, you just asked my question better than I did, so thank you.
No. I think you also asked a bunch of other pieces to this. So, but I would say that, I mentioned perspective before, right? It's all about the glasses that you're wearing, right? And there's something so powerful of like, when we are in a bad mood, like suddenly the world is just not the same. And when we're in a good mood, suddenly the world feels beautiful. Our internal experience very much informs our external experience. You could walk by a tree, but yet it took you to go on a vacation far away to appreciate what a tree is, right? And so sometimes we forget, but we're constantly guided, I think, by our experiences. But also, in terms of my personal background, first and foremost, just as a Jew who aims to pray with intention, I'm constantly calling upon my ancestors. I'm constantly thinking about who sent me here and whose shoulders I'm standing on and who paved the way for me and what I'm trying to uphold for the sake of what they did for me that I could do for my descendants. This idea, some call it Masorah, a chain, right? This idea of legacy and holding legacy. So yes, I feel very much that when I pray 3 times a day, I'm thinking about who sent me. And my identity definitely informs the work and how I focus. And the legacy of my ancestors also informs how I focus on the world today. Also on the note of ancestors is I have different ancestors. My father's side of the family, he was raised in a somewhat secular home in the New York area in the early 50s. And my mother was raised in Chicago, in Hyde Park, in a home that was interracial. My mom was raised in the Black Methodist Church, was where her family would go as a kid, and she was her mother fought in the American their family, that thread of their family fought in the American Revolutionary War and the Civil War. Their names are Nicholas Gibbs, who's the one who fought in the Revolutionary War, and George Gibbs, who fought in the Civil War. Mm-hmm. And on my mother's father's side of the family, they were slaves in Sawyerville, Alabama. And so I grew up knowing that my family, my ancestry, they all were channeling into my family, right? Who me and my siblings were. I'm the lightest of my siblings. I'm one of 3 boys, and the youngest as well. And, the term Jew of color was not a term we used growing up. That's not how we defined ourselves. Even now, when I use the word, I also know that it's an imperfect term because it's not actually descriptive of people, the varying experiences for different people of color, right? And when we say Jews of color, the experience of someone from, who's Latinx or Asian descent is not the same experience as someone who's Black in America. It's just not. And so Jews of color, it's helpful and an important term, I think, functionally for understanding and creating visibility around these issues as it relates to racial equity and racial justice and inclusion in the community, in the Jewish community, broadly defined. And I would say that that this term, that personally for me, I do identify as a Jew of color, but I also identify as mixed race, and I also identify as multiracial. And just in terms of terms, biracial would mean that you are from predominantly 2 races, right? And so that would be my mother is actually biracial. Multiracial would be that you hold many different racial origins, and so I think all of us in many ways are multiracial as a species. And so the last thing I'll say before I pause is we shouldn't forget that racial constructs aren't real. And, but they have real implications. And so we shouldn't get stuck in the language because what do you mean? Like, Adam v'Chava, we come from the same people, right? We have the same origin story. And yet, even though that's true, that's not necessarily how it plays out in a societal context that's defined by race. So I think it's important for us to remember.
Okay. I'd like to ask you what might be a bit of a fraught question that relates to what you were just talking about. Maybe pushes against it a little bit. But I'm just wondering what your perspective is on little bit of a debate that I've heard over the course of time as to whether Jews who do not identify themselves as Jews of color are in North America in the 20th and 21st century are white or not.
Right. Like when looking at the racial makeup of American Jewry, right? There were Sephardi Jews, Spanish and Portuguese who were here already in early 1600s. And then we have different points in American history where Jews were starting to migrate to America. In the 1700s, the first decade, second decade of the 1700s, there were anywhere from 200 to 500 Jews in America. By the Civil War, it was 150,000. By the 1880s and 90s, it had jumped to almost 1 million. And then by World War I, in World War II, 3 million, 5, like we see a growing spike of Jews. So where are most of the Jews coming from? Europe, Eastern and Western Europe, Caucasian, from the racial constructs that we mentioned earlier that aren't real, that actually have real ramifications. There was racial constructs within a Western frame of America that European was seen as Caucasian. But we know that not every single group that came over actually could just identify as white. Some say that the whiteness as a cultural identity is a learned identity, right? If America was built upon the black-white dichotomy, as they say, a black and white, and that and white being dominant and in power, and people who are non-white not being in power. And so if there were groups of people that theoretically had light skin, but didn't come from those dominant places, i.e., the United Kingdom and Britain and these dominant countries of where people were originating from, and colonialist countries as well. There was a learning process of negotiating your racial status. Now we know before America, Jews were racialized as a group and persecuted greatly. But America was actually pretty much the first opportunity where we could negotiate our social status. So when it comes to like the outward mobility of, the frontier in the 1700s, early 1700s, yeah, Jews could go. People of color couldn't go. So there's from the origins, from the very beginning. Now it's true there were policies against Jews from the founding days around religion. But we know also that there were, in Philadelphia and also in the early 1700s, there was an act and a bill that was set forth to support the freedom of religion. And these things came up to then be codified in the foundations of American society. But again, Jews and the process of are Jews white, it's on the one hand, is anyone white as a construct? But on the other hand, if there's a dominant culture that's called whiteness, and then Jews who are adapting to a brand new society, trying, think about thousands of years of persecution. If we have an opportunity to adapt and hold ourselves and have a status of frankly not being persecuted or experiencing anti-Semitism, there was an acculturation process. And in many ways, there's, the scholars who speak about these issues, they speak to whether that was, in many ways assimilating to America, the dominant American voice, like what happened exactly for Jews to be associated as white. With that said, we know Jews are multicultural, multi-ethnic people. We are, if you go to jewishfederations.org and you go to our global work, Global Jews, we support, with the gracious work of JDC and the Jewish Agency, over 70 countries of Jewish life. If you just Google global Jewish population, right? So I mean, which Jews are we talking about when we ask the question, are Jews white also, and how, because I think we're in a specific context, in an American context, we need to hold the paradox of what it might mean that we are and we aren't, or some are and some aren't, and I think that nuance will actually serve us in a serious way for Jewish identity in the 21st century. The last thing I'll say on this, and goes to the conversation around Jews of color as well, is, there's a New York Times article, but there's plenty of literature out there speaking about America reaching its tipping point of being a majority minority, where in 2040, 2044, right, and the sociologists know this, right? So people are planning for this. By 2044, America will be majority non-white. Right, so we're becoming more multicultural as we speak, right? And that we know that the Jewish community, we're usually, as much as we have our own codes of conduct and how we navigate our own inner societies, we are closely linked in the data to the broader American society when it relates to marriage, when it relates to divorce, when it relates to other, God forbid, other hard issues that we see in data and statistics. Yes, there are ways in which we're very much different, but we are a product of our society, and there is a beautiful process of how my family came into being, and it is a story of American love, and so Jews and how we are and who we aren't, and and I think to the point around how people identify, it's always just a good rule, and I'll pause here. It's always a good rule to not tell someone how they should identify. Let them identify themselves. It's just smarter, and if you're thinking something, yes, we have our prejudice, yes, we have our bias, but the second you say it out loud, you might be discriminating, you might be unintentionally perpetuating racist tropes or otherwise and other things. So it's usually best to just let someone identify how they are and who they think they are.
Good. Sounds like good advice. Given some of the nuances in terms of identity and self-identification and so forth that you've been talking about, and given, as you say, the fact that the Jewish community in the United States, in many respects, mirrors the more general American experience in terms of identity and so forth, which would you say currently presents more of a challenge in terms of race relations? Is it how the Jewish community relates to issues of systemic racism, or as some would argue, the lack of systemic racism, but that's another whole question, in society writ large, or is it a question of race relations within the Jewish community?
I mean, yes, both, all of the above. But I would say that, it's easy to have a magnifying glass on this moment. It's easy to feel like this moment has never existed the way this moment is existing. Let's say an urgency around recognizing the racial disparities of how our American structural racism, our American society has been built. Or, and like you say, it's contested. What does that even mean, structural systemic racism? How do you prove it? And there's proof. Just look at policy. Look at legislation over the last 250 years, and you'll see how it's disadvantaged people of color. And not always, and there's good policy. And that's why we should continue with the work that you're doing and the work that we're doing. And so, but I would say that just to zoom out for a second and recognize that that I think one of the challenges of this moment is how do we actually learn, relearn, and unlearn how race has impacted both our own community of American Jewry with all of our different racial backgrounds, Jews of color, mixed race, multiracial Jews, Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews, just people of all varying identities that people hold in the 21st century, right? Like how we are understanding how identity functions and how it impacts us is just a general exposure and learning that in many ways I'm not sure we've done a good job of over the last 50, 60, 70 post-Holocaust Jewry to really express and to have space where people can feel like they can be their whole selves. You know, sometimes people feel like, you know, I remember reading Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, you know, one of the post-Enlightenment great rabbis of German Jewry, and, you know, the end of the 19th century, he says that he's fearful for the synagogue as a model because people will start to slice up their Jewish identities. They'll say, oh, when I go to synagogue, I pray and I'm holy. But when I go to the bar, I'm this way. And when I'm on the street, I'm that way. And when I'm talking to this person, I'm that way. And when I'm at home, I'm this way. But really, the idea is that we're integrating into who we are as a way of life to have this idea of sanctity and holiness as a part of who we are. So when it comes to racial equity and racial justice, how are we integrating these values into who we are in our institutions for the long term, not just for a moment? When it comes to race relations, building partnerships, authentic and resilient relationships, that takes work. And it's a choice. It's a choice that people need to make, right? In order to really think as individuals and as organizations and institutions. How do we view issues around racial equity and racial justice? How do we view our Jewish racial identity in America? Like what are the varying identities, the diverse Jewish racial identities, and how are we seeing that and integrating that voice? Where are we seeing it on when the rabbi is speaking on high holidays, when we have children's books, when we're thinking about schools and the teachers at the schools and what kids are seeing as normalized, where we learn about global Jewry and not just one particular city, you know. And so I think there's the challenge, not necessarily of the work that internally in the Jewish community, the work around race relations. I think looking at this work as holistic, as work that is not new. I've been alive for far longer than since Shavuot, since May of 2020, or even if you want to start looking at some of the trends around racial inclusion, racial equity, racial justice, and diversity and inclusion work around these issues. You know, there have been organizations that have been around for 20 plus years. There have been practitioners who have been working as Jews of color and others in the field around racial equity and racial justice in the Jewish community for 30, 35 plus years, right? So this isn't new work. And in many ways, I think, you know, one thing that I would ask is, have we made a choice to be involved in just how we make choices about what we learn and who we hang out with, and what schools we decide to go to, and what professions we have and relationships we want to cultivate? Have we made a choice to integrate conversations around social equity as a whole and racial equity and racial justice in America into our diet of information that and also our actions and where we show up? So
it sounds like a wonderful set of challenges, particularly right before Rosh Hashanah. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
No, I love that you're saying that. I mean, it's, you know, Hayom Harat Olam, right? This is there's the Midrash, the rabbis say that the world was created on the 25th day of Elul, and so the sixth day of creation was the birthday of humanity. And to think about, you know, I know that the Sefer Yetzirah, the B'nai Yissaschar, commenting on the qualities of each month, right? Elul is a time of ma'aseh, like Sheshet Yemei HaMa'aseh. It's about creation. It's about what are we doing? What are we doing as it relates to our relationships internally with ourselves, la'atzmo, right? L'chavero, to our community, and also spiritually to the divine and how we connect. And so it's a time of Maaseh, but what's cool about Tishrei, the 7th month in the Jewish calendar, 7, it's Shabbos. It's this time where we celebrate humanity, where we celebrate our common bond, as it's our birthday this day, but we go into Shabbos together. We go into a time of ideally unity where we celebrate and bask in goodness. So I think Rosh Hashanah is an incredible time. And this time in general, I mean, it's a time where we ought to think about our common humanity more.
I'd like to. We're coming close to our end time here of this conversation, but we still have a little bit of time if you're game. I'd like to ask what's potentially a difficult question. I might be wrong. It might not be. You're working on social equity issues in a fraught moment in an organization that on some level represents or seeks to represent the Jewish community writ large. I suspect that in that capacity, given what you do and where you're doing it, you have conversations or interactions with people on issues that can be viewed as deeply political, with people who who occupy a different space than you and different than others who they're working with on the political spectrum. And I don't want you to get, let me put it this way, I'm not asking you to get political yourself in responding to that, but I'm just wondering how you navigate that challenge, if I'm right that it's a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is that the federation system historically and the 146 federations were about serving the people, right? When there are needs, we try to fill those needs, to see the incredible ways in which the federation system has stepped up for Jewish communal life across the country and Canada and around the world, just even during COVID-19. I would say that just in response to your question, you know, we're not a political institution in the slightest. Like, that's not our focus. Now, politics, we know, plays a critical role in structure of American Jewish life as well as American life as a whole. And we have a whole public affairs team, you know, and a Washington, D.C. office. We're very actively engaged in supporting legislation and policy that serves not only the Jewish community, but serves American society as a whole. And our work around legislation and policy is different than politics, right? And so I'd say that we are as a you know, and I can only speak from my understanding of the federation system, but the federation system is about the people, supporting the longevity and the sustainability of the Jewish people. And, you know, getting into the political game would honestly prevent us in many ways from optimizing our opportunity to serve. And so I think we're about policy and not about politics.
Okay. I'd like to close out here by asking you to respond to the following thought. It seems to me that we find ourselves both as a Jewish community and as an American community more broadly at a time of challenge, of difficulty on all kinds of levels in terms of racial equity issues, social equity issues, issues like that come up in light of the COVID epidemic, but that go beyond that. But I'd like to think also that we find ourselves at a time of hope. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how to navigate the tension between the challenge and the hope that we're facing right now.
So real. I mean, I'll say that so much of the work that I'm doing daily is engaging with organizations and institutions, schools, synagogues, rabbis, spiritual leaders, leaders at the federation system, you know, and in the different federations throughout our country. And I would say that I'm hopeful because of all of the work that's being done. I mean, there's so much work that I mean, it's incredible. It's incredible to think about how people are actively engaging in a process of confronting blind spots that communities might have had until this moment, by learning, by engaging in a campaign around education, and learning and unlearning, you know, our history as a country. And I think there's a reckoning, there's a truth-telling process, there's a tshuva process, some would say, that I think a lot of I'm seeing. I mean, and then there's also just an eagerness to do more and to do better. And you know, we know that this current movement for racial justice is the largest civil rights movement in American history. We know that it's multiracial and multicultural and multi-ethnic and multi-faith, and so this is a moment of I think like a really great moment for our country. And in terms of where we're going in the future, there's obviously uncertainty. There's obviously a lot of darkness. There's obviously a lot of hate and evil that we're seeing in the world. And to hold those two, you know, as paradox for sure. There's a line that says "Ivdu es Hashem b'simcha," right? That we should serve God in simcha. But there's also a line from King David that says that we should serve God b'gila v'rada. We should be joyous and have a sense of gila, rina, so this idea of gila, like something of joyous and excitement, but also barada, that we should have a little bit of trepidation, of feeling like there's, and holding those two things, the idea that there's both at the same time, I think is very much Jewish. We know Rosh Hashanah is both called, you know, this day of Yom Hadin, right? It's a day of judgment, some would say. It's a day of tremendous sensitivity and intensity. But then it's also the birthday of humanity, and it's also a time where we tap into this voice, as we mentioned before, of what is yet to come, and also acknowledging that we've arrived to this moment, Shechianu. And if Shechianu teaches us is that we have the capacity to arrive to a moment. We have the capacity to be here. There's something that brought us here, and so you know, the idea of holding, while there is both hardship in the world, what is yet to come in the good, and then also the Shechianu is that there is good. Look at what we've already been engaging with. So, but I'll also say that having hope today is like, you know, I've heard this from others, and I think it's really true. Engaging in hope is like is an act of courage in many ways. Engaging in love, to love others that you don't know, or to love the humanity in somebody, regardless of if you disagree with them, is an act of courage. It's like doing push-ups. It's like doing spiritual push-ups these days. And so I hope we should all be blessed to be able to engage in that process.
Well, I look forward, as obviously you do, also to a year and the broader future of many spiritual push-ups. Thank you so much, Rabbi Isaiah. Shana Tova.